You're listening to 99.1 WQRT LP, and welcome to Radio Free Book Club for November 2022. I'm Ken Honeywell. I'm a writer and reader from Indianapolis, and today we'll be discussing the new dystopian novel by Ken Kalfus, 2 a.m. in Little America. It's a book that depicts a future in which the United States has been ripped apart by civil war and Americans are refugees. It's a short novel with a lot to sort out, and we have just the crew who can help us do that. Let's get started with some introductions. Christine?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Hudson. Also, I would like to call myself a writer and reader from Indianapolis, though not quite on par with Ken. But yeah, grew up around Indy, went just away to DePaul University in Greencastle for school, moved back, have mostly worked in marketing, and spend most of my spare time reading, hanging out with my cats, watching TV and movies, and riding my bike. But also collecting lots and lots of books. So yeah, that's me, Christine Hudson.
Yeah, Christine. Well, I've read your writing, and I know what a good reader you are. So yeah, we can talk about that later. Well, I didn't know we were going to have a DePaul Wabash throwdown in this.
No,
Steve Woods.
Yeah, I'm done.
So Steve Woods, 1993 graduate of Wabash College, current owner of the Monon Bell, along with my other brothers. I'm a financial advisor here in Indianapolis and an avid reader, and it's my third show. I'm very excited to be here.
Thanks, Steve. And someone new to the book club, Alex Mattingly.
Hey, my name's Alex Mattingly. I'm also a reader and writer, but I feel like that's been, gone over at this point. Formerly an Indianapolis native, although recently just moved out to Fillmore, Indiana, which is near Greencastle and DePaul. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to take the DePaul side today just by proximity.
Fair.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Alex. And just a note, while it's possible we'll stray from the topic a little bit, if we have any like Monon Bell stories or anything like that, this is a book club where we actually talk about the book. So heads up, there will be some spoilers. If you're looking forward to reading 2 a.m. in Little America, you might want to change the station and come back when you're done. You can find all the episodes of Radio Free Book Club on a podcast on Mixcloud, Spotify, wherever you stream podcasts. So with that in mind, let's get started. Christine, I know you had some feelings about this book. You want to give us a little setup?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for some background about myself and what I bring to an experience when I'm reading, I think for me, books fall into two categories, right? Like books that you read for fun, to escape and like curl up with on a rainy day and a glass of wine and just vibe out with the book, right? So that's what I was expecting for 2 a.m. in Little America. The summary, like reading over the summary, I was like, this is right up my alley. I saved it for a rainy day, took the afternoon off from work, and was so excited to read it. But it fell into the other category of book for me, which is a book that is a struggle to get through because it hits every single nerve of everything I want to escape from when I'm reading. So that being said, I came into this book with the experience of, or like expecting to just sit down and have a really fun cover-to-cover read, followed by a great conversation. And almost immediately, so that the scene opens with Ron, the protagonist, like spying on this woman and thinking, oh no, I should run away. I could get deported. And then he's like, oh, she can't see me. This is totally fine. I'm not hurting anyone. I no longer care. Right. And I was just like, oh God, like as a woman who's used to like, I'm always concerned about that. Like, this is not what I want to read right now, but I'll keep going. And each page was like another facet of my lived experience that I just wanted to escape from. So about 40 pages in, I was like, oh God, this is hard. Like, this is really, really hard. And so the summary, like, I think from what I'm bringing to the experience and sort of like, or what I'm bringing to the book is, here's the summary I have, which I think this is maybe boiling it down to the simplest terms, but it's where I'm coming from. So this book is about a white American man who suddenly finds himself the other and has to live in, navigate, and work for the system that oppresses him. And I am unable almost to see the book as anything else. I even wrote this, like, I think maybe around the halfway mark, I wrote, this feels like being bludgeoned over the head with my own lived experiences. But like this person is just now realizing that this has always been someone else's experience. And it was hard. It was really, really hard. For listeners, I'm a 34-year-old African-American woman, grew up sort of straddling two existences, a lot like W.E.B. Du Bois's like double consciousness, where you're this, but you're also that. And so you have to be this and that everywhere you go. And so that's the experience I brought to this book. And I think that this is a long summary, I'm sorry, but I think what Kalfus chose in turning the tables and having Americans be sort of the unwanted refugees is, I think, probably the best way to get readers to imagine, like, oh, God, is this what it's like? Is this what it feels like? And the answer is yes. I think I can't speak from being, obviously, I live in America, always have, but just from sort of being a Black woman and sort of being a kind of other, I thought this was a really, really accurate representation of what that lived experience is like. And I think this setting, this sort of dystopian reality in Little America, like a microcosm of our culture and politics, it's really good. So I loved it in that sense, but hated it in the sense that, like, I just wanted to curl up and read a fun book. So that's a very long summary.
No, I think that's great, Christine. And I in a way, I feel bad about asking you to read it because because you're exactly right. I mean, I think it's a very hard book, and as the opposite, as an old white guy in America, it hit me very, very powerfully. Just imagining that experience of being the other, and also of being not just the other, but a refugee, someone who really had no ownership of the land he was living in.
I think it's interesting that you bring up the double consciousness, because I feel like that was something throughout the book. You feel Ron, the narrator, struggling to choose a narrative or resist a narrative that will kind of define and shape his life. We don't really know what the conflict was that kind of destroyed America, and we don't really know what Ron's own allegiances are. And these are all choices that the narrator makes because he's telling it in his own voice. And so much of this book seems to be him sort of consciously resisting taking up residence in any mental space as much as a physical one until about halfway through the novel. And so it's just sort of an interesting disorientation that happens reading this book, where you're really not sure kind of what the grounding is. That was one thing that I think I struggled with a little bit reading this book, was that it seemed almost so light on certain details that it sort of lent it a more kind of mythic quality, or it felt almost like a fable more than what I would typically have thought of with like maybe more grounded speculative fiction. I think it does kind of lie in that area. And he just makes such a conscious choice not to let himself believe anything fully, even who other characters are. There's this constant confusion about who these other people are, if he's met them before, or if they're all different people, which we can get more into later. But it was just an interesting approach to that struggle of rootlessness, to not even allow him to root himself in his own narrative or story about who he is or where he is.
And, following up on that, would that be kind of intentional? Because I saw him as a kind of adrift on a life raft being tossed about kind of on in angry seas, right? Not taking a stand anywhere, which, is that a larger commentary on where we're at as a country, as white men, is that some sort of commentary about, kind of where we at currently? So that kind of, Ken, like you had said, that kind of hit me and struck me as someone that has not been in that situation, and it kind of shook you a little bit. I wasn't as bothered by the fact that he didn't have details about how they got there, but the lack of any detail and Ron's kind of inability to choose sides, even when he's helping certain factions, was a bit of a head scratcher. He just wanted to be so distanced from everything that, by choosing nothing, who's he helping and what's he doing, I suppose.
Well, and I think that also the idea of the peeping Tom actually plays into that as well. And that is a theme kind of throughout the book, too, of somebody watching someone else who is unaware that they're being watched. And also, I mean, Ron thinks he's being watched throughout the entire novel. So, but I mean, I guess that's a question, too. Are we... is part of the issue here the fact that we are standing by watching stuff happen, but we're not hurting anyone. I mean, and I think that was the justification for doing it, right? That was that was Marlise's justification for watching Ron for an hour before she approached him. If I'm not hurting you, then what's the harm? But we're also not helping anything, and. I just that struck me as well.
I thought the sort of ongoing peeping Tom theme was really, really fascinating in the sense of I sort of read it in a way that does, if no one knows about it, does it still hurt? The answer is yes, but the damage might actually be more on the one who peeps. That's a terrible phrase, but it might be more on so if Ron is watching a woman through the window, he thinks she can't see, there's no harm. But I think the takeaway for the person who's peeping is, and I think especially what Kalfus was going for, is it gets into consent and the male gaze, which is another reason I started to get panicky reading this, because I thought it was such an interesting way to bring up questions of that gaze, right, of the male gaze and of consent. And then also throughout the novel, I think that also the sort of peeping Tom element also adds to the identity. And I think there's a question about sort of camera obscura, or seeing yourself through someone else's eyes or through someone else's image, which I think also even plays back to issues with double consciousness and Ron's identity and his search to find a footing in a community where he belongs, because the place and the physical and mental place where he built his identity is gone, right? So, right. Yeah, I thought somehow all of that worked together, and very strangely enough, I think back to the peeping Tom, the one who peeps is actually, I think, the one that's creating trouble for themselves later. I think it blurs the lines of consent so much that they think, I can get away with this, so what's next, and next, and next, and next. And then it comes back around to bite him in the butt later when, Marlise is watching him and he's like, I'm uncomfortable with this. And then every time they meet up, he thinks he's being watched. And I'm like, yeah, it feels bad, doesn't it, Ron? That's not so great.
Yeah, I also kind of love that whole air of mystery of everything throughout the book. I kept trying to imagine where this was set. Did anybody have any ideas about where they thought it was set?
No, and I mean, he seems to make a point of making it as difficult as possible. Even when people say they're natives to whatever country they're in, their grandparents are from another country, and then he makes a point of saying, well, they don't look like they're from that. So he seems to be throwing up these deliberate dust clouds to make it as difficult as possible to try to pin it down.
Yeah, the language is squiggles, written in squiggles, and they have tofu, and but there's mountains and forests and
water. Yeah, and it's a lack of borders and a lack of identity, which is at least if you're missing an identity, you're at least within a defined border, a defined country. Or if you don't understand your identity, at least you're in America, you're in Canada. And this was 0 for 2. But for some reason, the first part of the book I imagined was in Lisbon. I think just because I just got back from traveling Lisbon, and the way that they described walking along the Corniche and the Navy Yard, and there's mountains, I was imagining it was Lisbon or Europe. And then the latter half of the book, I have no empirical data for this, but it sounded like some Eastern European country. I don't know. That's just the vibe I got.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Lisbon's an interesting thought. Portugal is certainly a popular choice for American expats these days.
Yeah, I can attest to that. It's great. But I mean, I agree. I like not having those kinds of answers and details, because I think once you define a place, you get into the politics and the nature of that place, which takes away from the whole story, right? It's about not having a place. It's about, this little America, quote unquote, that was made from like the shambles of America's Civil War that, tore it apart. So I liked it. I liked that there was no clear country or place named. I thought it was pretty neat. And it makes your attention focus elsewhere on other themes.
Yeah, and I think Ron, as a narrator, just seems to have an allergy for any kind of storytelling or narrative, that he's just constantly resisting kind of becoming a part of someone else's story. So even going so far as to tell us what country he's in, to kind of put those concrete details in, he seems to be fighting that as much as possible.
Yeah, and even the Civil War in America, we never see the words Civil War. We don't really know anything specifically that happened. We know of some vague atrocities that happened in a Target store, but we don't really know a lot that happened. How did that sit with you, Steve?
Oh, it was very uncomfortable, and you kind of envision that in your mind, and there are certainly examples of that here recently with Abu Dhabi, and I mean, that's one of the things that I thought about, just the treatment that these, whatever side that was in America, gave to their enemies was startling. And they, the female protagonist was trying to rationalize that. Well, I wasn't really involved in that. That was more Buster. I didn't want him to do that. But she was complicit in everything. But it did, that part certainly hit home, that it was very uncomfortable.
Yeah, here, I just want to read. This is about as close as he comes to describing, if not exactly what happened, the reasons for what happened. He says, "We discovered that the conflict, as painful and tragic as it had been, was really a contest between texts, each telling the history of our country plausibly and compellingly, and neither necessarily built on untruths. Opposing narratives, we learned, could easily be constructed from the same actual occurrences and objective facts. Additional information, a recent provocation, a piece of demographic data, a politician's accidental candor, could be valued by one side and discounted by the other, even though both could agree that the reporting was technically correct. It was only a matter of storytelling." Any response to that?
So there's something that stood out to me about that passage. We've talked a couple times now about the peeping Tom, and then also there's several references to people looking at someone else through a mirror or a camera obscura. And I think he's describing two different ways of seeing that kind of relates to this competition between text and context, where one way of seeing is to try to be an observer without having any kind of effect. The other kind of seeing, though, seeing something through the mirror, is also kind of how we interpret things through stories. You're seeing something that's really there, but when you have a narrative around it, you're seeing a distortion. And if you're not aware that it's distorted, you're going to misinterpret that information. And so all these times when he sees mirrors, and then at the end of the novel, the Amanda Keller or Marley, or this character who may or may not be the same person, she describes herself as the mirror image of the war criminal. And I think she's making kind of an explicit statement that she's changing her own narrative to kind of change herself as a person. I don't know how to tie these ideas together, but I think he's making an argument in there about the way storytelling can distort things, and that if we're not always aware of how it's distorting things, then like he says in that passage, we can all agree on the same set of facts and then still somehow come to these differences that are so irreconcilable that they destroy the fabric of society.
Yeah, especially when, like I think Ken, in response to that in that exact passage, which I just tried to find because I think I wrote notes in the margin, but I can't find it. But I wrote
it's page 106.
I wrote like based on that I sort of like the decision not to say exactly what happened because it's not important. Like this isn't about the downfall; it's about the aftermath. Yeah, I did highlight it. So I wrote, I feel like we probably tore ourselves apart by acting on that misinformation or disinformation and miseducation. Because it's one thing to hear different stories, and even if you don't like it, but don't necessarily take an action based on misinformation or disinformation or misunderstanding of a story or misunderstanding the context. I think that's a lot different. But I think especially lately, I'm not sure if it's just the fact that like as a voting aged adult, you feel more inspired to take action. But I feel like lately it's just felt like people are taking substantial actions on very little information. And maybe listening to and respecting the stories of others, but by and large, hearing one fact and acting on it. And I feel like that passage is about, and that's what happened. I think that's exactly what happened. People acted on the stories they wanted to believe, or people made up stories based on facts and acted on it.
And so within the context of Ron, his inaction also has some culpability in that, just like that peeping Tom. Well, no one's getting hurt. I didn't lock anybody up in the Target, so I'm not really responsible. But coming back to that, there is some again, culpability in not doing anything.
Yeah, I think you're right, Steve. And I think it's interesting, just kind of the roots of the conflict. There's a piece in the New York Times today, and for everyone listeners' benefit, we're recording this about a week and a half before it airs. But there's a piece in the Times today that said there's a recent national study. Actually, it said it was a cross-national study, and I'm not sure exactly what that means, if that means across the nation or across nations. But basically, the study says that Americans have become so tied to party identity that we're less polarized by race and class than we are by party identity. And that is a scary place for me to be. And that seems like, however we want to kind of dance around the issue, it seems like that's what blew up America in this novel.
And I feel like there's also a lot of interesting mentions of how careful Ron is to not of his appearance. So he's not affiliated with the wrong side.
Right. Like he had the wrong dog.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he mentioned people would have, you have to put a handkerchief in this pocket, or if you style your hair this way. Yeah, everything. It's just this is 100% accurate. And it even made me think of one thing that I think specifically with my background, it made me think of was this is sort of the way that gangs operate. You have to affiliate into a gang, and that is your identity, and you base your whole appearance around that identity. And obviously I've not been in a gang, but in reading about gangs, this is exactly what it's like. And, this has been copied from one subset of culture in big previous America to Ron's subculture in Little America.
So I want to ask, do we believe, so there's 2 points in the novel, about halfway through, Ron visits what's essentially a memorial site, and he walks his dog across it, and the dog takes a big dump on the site, and it feels like a very political act. And then at the end of the novel, we've kind of alluded to these atrocities that happened in a Target, and Ron basically helps the people who probably committed these atrocities cover it up. And so I'm just wondering, for a guy who has tried so hard not to take sides or to be anonymous, those two things seem like pretty big decisions that he doesn't comment a whole lot on, and he kind of claims innocence for the dog taking the dump on the memorial, but it feels like everything he's told us so far makes it hard to believe that he really doesn't know what he's doing. So I'm just wondering, what everybody made of that.
I would say I don't I don't understand why he went back to the government building the second time and let them all in. I mean, in the end of the paragraph before that, he was dead set against it. But I guess maybe he felt like that his boss had given him the keys, the new keys, for that reason, that they were actually in cahoots. So I guess that's probably why he did it. I guess he figured he wasn't going to get in trouble for doing that. But that was a puzzle to me.
So would that be, to what Christine was saying earlier, would that be not taking a side and passively letting something happen? Or is that a deliberate act that is choosing a side?
Well, at that point, the two American sides were one. Right, so I don't know. He certainly is taking a side, but as far as his sides went, they were combined, right? I mean, it was the two American factions. It was not only Buster, but also the tall guy who was there to burn down the target, who were working together at the end to disrupt whatever they were disrupting in the country they were living in now. So, what does that say about America, maybe?
I found Ron to, just in general, trying to understand why Ron does or thinks or says anything was a mystery. I think, Ken, one of the questions you sent out to the group was like, is Ron trustworthy? Are his actions credible? And I think I just wrote no. Nothing that Ron says or does makes any sense. I don't know if that is on purpose. I'm assuming that, Kalfus would have done that on purpose. I'm sure he knows how to write a solid character. So it must have been on purpose, but I found it really difficult to even understand or sympathize with anything Ron did, because it's just I can respect an unreliable narrator, but I felt like he was actively contradicting himself. Yeah. And so I just was whatever this man is doing is beyond me.
I mean, he's essentially helping this detective whenever he shows up, and then he's also helping
another act of a peeping Tom. What's the difference between a peeping Tom and a spy?
Right.
I guess a spy just talks, right?
Yeah.
But it was kind of like a 1984 situation. It was like, well, who are we at war with, Winston? It's, East Asia or Eurasia. And he's helping kind of both sides, which kind of goes back to my, he is a rudderless ship just being tossed around by whoever needs him and whoever can squeeze him for this information or access to buildings or whatever. He just tries to help them so he can then get out of it. Mm-hmm. But by helping them, he's more and more ingrained in each of those sides.
And yet he knows, because, just on the page opposite the last one I read, there's a paragraph that says, and I knew that the contest hadn't been equal, whatever personal virtues adhered to individual partisans. Both sides had not suffered equally. A roughly equal number of atrocities was not committed by both sides. Both sides had not contributed equally to the misunderstanding, which was really not a failure of communication, but rather a single side's self-interested distortion of American history and its willful blindness to contemporary wrongdoing. Of course, I brought my own history and prejudices to the argument. So he did have a side. I mean, he did have some kind of a conscience, I guess.
And I feel like I'm trying to find, at some point, I feel like he said his best protection was being anonymous, which I thought I had highlighted. But he said that quite early on, which I think is quite clear. He valued anonymity. Oh, as page 78, it looks like. This is when the detective is approaching him to just even be a spy, I guess, or what's the word I'm looking for? There was a specific thought I had where it's like an informant, right? You are going to rat out your
a stoolie.
Yeah, exactly. But he says, even without contacting them, I'd become an organ of the police, jettisoning the anonymity that was my most secure protection. I more intensely sense I was being watched and that my movements through the enclave were being mapped, analyzed, and indelibly recorded, and possibly not by only the police. So I feel like this is page 77, so I feel like he was starting to become unraveled. I think the anonymity was sort of his last hope, and then he lost that. And I also think that ties into the fact that, like, one of the things that drove me really crazy about Ron, the guy can't tell anyone apart. He doesn't know who anyone is. So it's like the side he thinks he's helping, can we even rely on that? Like, does he know one person from the next? Because I didn't get the sense that he did, like, at all. One person was everyone for him.
Well, in jumping to the end, when he went to the police station, no one had heard of this detective.
Right.
And so we don't even know who that person was. I mean, everyone could be a double agent, or everyone could have been working on the same side. And he had no idea who he was helping. He just wanted to help somebody and kind of then drift back into the background and become anonymous again.
Yeah, I think that I found the anonymity very credible in terms of what I would imagine a refugee experience might be. You know, wanting to keep your head down, wanting to make sure you didn't attract that much attention. That felt credible to me, and I also felt like although I'm not sure I had a lot of confidence in anything Ron said, I do feel like he was Ron. He was actually Ron Patterson, because he was recognized on the street more than once as Ron Patterson, compared with all the women in the story who, I mean, let's tackle that one. We have the woman in the shower who he thought was Marlise, who he thinks is Nikisha, with Amanda, whatever Amanda's name, Amanda Keller, wrapped up all in there somewhere. What do we think is going on here?
I think there's enough there that makes me think they are all the same person, because it's almost like a relay race. Like, each one kind of references enough of the last one that you think, well, that's weird that there would be a thread there. But also, I mean, there were a couple times, maybe more than a couple, when you had to really kind of suspend disbelief very intentionally. And I think either way this went, it required you to kind of accept something a little absurd. Like, either he really couldn't tell the difference between 5 different people who were different people, or just coincidentally, he keeps running into the same woman over and over and over, who keeps assuming different identities that happen to bring her into contact with him. So neither one of those options felt more plausible to me than the other, but just the way that character or characters behaved maybe put me 51% into the category of saying, yeah, I think they were all one person, but I could be easily persuaded the other way.
And I thought kind of the same thing until the very last sentence, where it said the driver looked familiar, which was, you know, I mean, then that just turns everything.
Yeah, and even that I reread and I was like, okay, he didn't say that she didn't get in the driver's seat of the van, you know, which is maybe overreading it, but at that point, yeah, you're like looking for any clue to like sew up this mystery and say, okay, it is this or it is that.
Yeah. Go no, please. No, you.
I was going to say, I'm the opposite. I think these are all different women, all different people. I don't think he knows. He on page 14, he says, I couldn't make a positive identification with the woman in the flat. I couldn't even be sure if these additional sightings were of the same person, especially after I saw her again in another neighborhood wearing a worker's denim overalls, and again elsewhere in yet other neighborhoods with longer hair and wire-rimmed eyeglasses, stouter, shorter. He doesn't know. He just like literally doesn't know. And then a little bit later, he says on page 53, he realizes that he has just been transferring that sort of initial fascination with the woman in the window over to whoever's in front of him at the time. So Marlise, and I think, but yeah, it's just like, I think these are all different people. He even talks about like an old friend, Ravi, and then the guy's like, that wasn't, his friend's like, that was not Ravi, that was totally someone else.
Yeah, a guy who recognizes him as Ron Patterson.
Says,
and they talk about how they used to hang out.
And he does, I don't think he knows who anyone is. And I mean, this is probably, again, colored by my own lived experience and interpretation, but I have this happen all the time. I went to a mostly all-white or mostly white private Christian school for K through 12, and there was one other non-white person in my class and one other non-white girl. And I was mistaken for her throughout my K through 12. We look nothing alike. We act nothing alike. We sound nothing alike. We weren't even friends. We don't have any of the same friends. I was mistaken for her by every teacher I ever had, to the point where I was given her homework back, and like they would give me her graded tests, and I'm like, I'm not Olivia. I'm still not Olivia. Oh. And it's just like this, and it has, I mean, it's happened in college, it's happened in my professional career. I think it's just like, he even says at one point, he's like, yeah, some of the people can't tell Americans apart. They think we all look the same.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, yeah, because like, that's what, I don't know. It's just, to me, that's what it came across as, is everyone looks the same to Ron. All these women are the same. And it doesn't matter. He doesn't really care. It's, you know, they are whoever he needs them to be in that moment.
Well, he's so displaced, you know, he even somewhere near the start of the book almost compares his longing for sex with his memories of his childhood where he was growing up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that kind of powerful association to him. And I guess I felt like that specific thing, that lack of being able to identify anyone positively, I felt like that was part of that whole displacement, you know, part of that refugee experience. And I guess I wonder, what do you guys think? Do you think that kind of depiction of the refugee experience seems credible?
I don't know. I've never been a refugee.
Yeah.
Like, what do we know? We're like, I'm sitting in the city where I grew up. Like, it's, I mean, I will say, I think there have been times where I've been traveling and have felt like lost and uncomfortable and kind of scared. And I'm like, God, imagine if there's no home to go to. Like, imagine if this is it. This is your whole life, is lost, uncomfortable, scared, not sure where to go next.
So would you want that sense of community, and would you invent that? And I wondered, did he see all these women as someone he may possibly know as some sort of tie to what once was in this, again, I'm beating this analogy to death, but just kind of in this ocean. Yep. He's just looking for some sort of beacon. And this woman, maybe her, maybe not her, kind of sure it is. I mean, he's just looking for something and confuses these women to all be the same. Because I didn't really get the sense that they were. They each needed something different from him, and maybe even use that to their advantage to get him to do things. Just kind of recognizing his kind of need, I suppose.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's the whole point of Little America. You know, we've split ourselves apart and then sort of rejoined, or sort of like realigned with like what we had left behind. And not we, but the refugees have they need a space, and so they have this like Little America, essentially. I think it's not impossible. It's hard to be without a home. It's hard to be without place. It's hard to be without a sense of belonging. And if there isn't one there, you make one.
And as he, you know, says again and again throughout the thing, his memories really become everything. His memories are his only, and were certainly his most valuable possessions. And that, I thought, was credible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even to the point where he wanted to take whatever female it was who had lost her son, he wanted to take and internalize the memories of her son. You know, let me now be the vessel that you can remember your son, and we can go off together. You don't need Buster. I can remember. Tell them to me. I will make them mine, and we can now live kind of together.
Yeah, right.
Which is interesting.
For the record, I agree with Alex. I think we're all the same woman. I stopped short maybe of the woman in the shower, but I think based on all those clues, but you're right, like that last sentence, that threw me a little bit. So what do you think? Is there anything specifically that you think just didn't work in the book, that you kind of threw you out of the the narrative?
I will say one thing I found frustrating, which is really the whole conversation we've been having, is like what's real and what isn't. I love an unreliable narrator, or I love a mysterious sense of place, or a mysterious sense of conflict, or an unnamed past conflict. But much like Ron adrift at sea, I just need something to be real. Like I need some real thing in the book to be defined beyond like a conflict. So I struggled with that. I just I felt like I couldn't get a grip.
Well, it's really a slippery narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, there is not a lot of description of what exactly, where we are, who we are, or
When
what's
we
going
are.
on. Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I would have liked to have one thing defined. Just one.
Yeah.
Just the one.
I mean, by throwing such a wide net, is he just trying to gather any sort of backstory that you're bringing to the book to have something relatable and leave really no one out? Was that a conscious decision?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Almost like a psychic. It's like, oh, you have changes in your life. Like, yeah, who doesn't, And then you build the story based on that.
Like, oh my gosh.
How does she know? Yeah, that's really interesting. But I feel like he's a competent, and I've never actually read anything else by Ken Kalfus, and I'm really interested to read the rest of his work. But I feel like he would be a competent enough writer to still provide something, some form of solid detail, but make it applicable to anyone. I don't know.
Yeah, I think if there was anything I struggled with reading this book, I think it was the coincidences that happened, and that's, the book didn't feel necessarily real to me in the way like a gritty realist novel might. But again, kind of the narrator having this job where he fixes computer boards that is apparently high demand, where whatever country he ends up in, that also grants him access to specifically places he needs to be to access these secret files that happen to be left in this room beneath a computer board. Things like that kind of, like I said, it requires some really deliberate suspension of disbelief, but there were a couple times when I just had to say, well, I think this is more of a moral fable or something, rather than like a narrative. Again, if we believe that the women in the story are all different women, then again, I guess some of the coincidences there. Yeah, I don't know. So I did struggle with that a little bit, but at the same time, I mean, so much of the novel seemed geared toward creating this effect of disorientation and confusion, and I do think that was all deliberate, to where you really are questioning everything, like, was that really his job, or is this just a plausible story he's telling us for why he's in these places at these times? I don't think I came away from this trusting the narrator very much. Which isn't to say I think he's a bad guy, but I don't necessarily feel like he was always playing honestly with the facts that he would recount, and he's not recounting lots of other facts, which left me not sure. I mean, Steve talking about being adrift in the ocean, that's kind of where I ended up, because I just really wasn't sure what I believed or how to interpret even the events that explicitly happened, let alone the things that were implied.
Yeah, I thought some of the coincidences bothered me too, and not just those that you mentioned that I agree with, Alex, but he ran into a lot of people from his hometown in this far distant country, which, if I'm doing the math right, is about 30 years after he left America. So that all seemed pretty coincidental to me. But that said, I love the idea that everything signified something. The cap you wore, the dog you walked, the where you walked, where you lived, who you spoke to, and it reminds me of this idea that I find really troubling, that we have divided ourselves in tribes so much that you kind of have to believe everything your tribe believes, right? You can't have an outlier opinion about any one of these points, or else you're not part of the tribe. That kind of struck me in this piece as well.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like that much of an exaggeration to say, the things you wear are telling someone something about your beliefs, because I feel like we've probably all had that experience of being far from home and kind of realizing, oh, I don't really, what I'm wearing doesn't make sense here. It doesn't, like, they can tell I'm not from here. And that does kind of speak kind of incidentally to political allegiances sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, what does it say if you are wearing a flag pin? You know, what does it say if you choose to shop at Target or Walmart? You know, does everything become a political act?
I don't know. It's interesting. And then almost like you're gaslighting yourself. Like, can I just like things? Like, can I just like the things I like? And the answer is no. You cannot just like the things you like.
Yeah. I mean, like country music. Are you allowed to like country music? That's a loaded question.
I'm kidding, yes. But so I feel like I've been really hard on this book. One thing I absolutely loved about it was the length. I think it is so hard to pack so many big ideas and feelings and discussions and thoughts and moods into 220-something pages.
Yeah, right.
Just incredible. Like, I think it's 230 pages, at least the hardback 2022 edition. It's amazing. I mean, I've read books 3 times this length with little substance, not little substance, but less substance than this. And I thought the writing was very nice, very almost poetic writing. There wasn't a ton of dialogue. And I thought the dialogue that was used, the characters all kind of sounded and spoke the same. I feel like depending on the writer or, you know, the narrative, sometimes you'll have very distinct voices, but I thought all these voices just sounded like Ron. You know, we're hearing the book through his eyes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I thought that was really interesting too, and I thought it worked really, really well for this book. I liked that sort of monotone character voice, and I thought the length was incredible. This book is probably a NaNoWriMo level, like probably 50,000 words, right?
Right.
It's incredible. There's and I was having strong reactions by page 15, which is maybe 2,000 words in, and I was already having a meltdown. I don't think I've ever been moved so much by a book in the first 50 pages. So,
yeah, it really it does a lot very quickly, and then it keeps doing it. I found myself reading the first half very fast, and then the second half much slower, just trying to kind of digest and figure out what was really going on. I mean, there are a lot of puzzles in this book. There's a lot of, I think, symbolism, or at least callbacks to things that could be symbolism, depending on how you want to take it. But I think, Christine, you're exactly right. It's a very dense book for how brief it is.
I would say the fact that you were hooked, even if not happy about it, that says something. I know for me, I was not dreading picking it up. I didn't read it in one afternoon, but I did find myself thinking about it when I was in the car, which is always a good sign.
Yep.
Whether you're, you never want to just trudge through these things. I will add that one of the things that I did really like was the fact that whatever happened was of our own doing, which is different than a lot of these types of novels where you think it is climate change or it's some sort of, nuclear war against whomever. Like in The Road, I just got the feeling that there was some sort of post-nuclear situation. Everything's gray in that. Book called Rivers by a friend of mine named Michael Ferris Smith deals with the kind of aftermath of a Katrina-type hurricane and what happens to the Gulf South. This is something that we did, and something that I think the author is shining a light on what could happen if we continue on the path towards maybe a type of civil war that just completely implodes all of the American exceptionalism we have come to, rest upon, and that we are better than every other culture, and then to throw us right into, the enclave where we're sleeping in, burned out buildings and trying to scrape together enough room for a cot and a little bit of privacy.
Yeah, in 2 a.m. in Little America, if they're not pitying us, they're laughing at us. Well, so we're kind of coming to time here. What do you all think? Would you recommend the book, Steve?
I would, for the same reasons that we've all kind of talked about, that it is very thought-provoking. You're going to have an opinion on this. It's a page-turner. It's not a huge commitment, especially if you read as fast as Christine, apparently. But I did like it, yes.
Alex?
Yeah, I would. It's not maybe the first thing I would have picked up on my own, but at the same time, there's not a lot of books like this. I don't think there's a lot of books that are this willing to be in a nebulous space, to kind of pack in ideas this way. So I think it was, worthwhile.
Yeah, Christine.
So, complicated answer. I would not recommend it for myself again, but I think this would make, and this might be an absolutely crazy opinion, I think it would make a really interesting YA novel. I think it's getting to the point of kind of like the Hunger Games and other like YA dystopian novels, but minus the annoying little romances and like fashion. I think this would probably make children cry, and like, I'm so sorry, and I bet Ken Kalfus was not thinking he was writing a YA novel, but I think it would be really good for like high school aged kids. I think it's super fascinating. So I would recommend it probably to certain readers who are sad teenagers.
Awesome. Well,
which is all of them, I think.
Right. Yeah. You can just say
having
teenagers.
a couple, I can
all teenagers.
Say that.
I agree. I agree with everyone. I was I was moved by it, but I mostly just really loved the style of it. I thought the writing style was very very interesting, very engaging. Yeah, really liked it. Well, let's do a round of recommendations. Steve Woods, what do you got?
I already teased it out there, but Michael Ferris Smith Rivers just kind of it called upon the kind of aftermath of some horrible tragedy, and that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, cool. That sounds great. And you say this is somebody you know.
Yeah, he's a buddy of mine.
Oh, awesome.
Nice.
So he could help him out too.
Yeah, excellent. Alex?
I'm going to recommend a book called The Coma by Alex Garland, who's probably better known at this point for movies.
Director.
Yeah, he wrote and directed Annihilation, Ex Machina. I think he wrote 28 Days Later. He also wrote The Beach, which was then made into a movie by with Leonardo DiCaprio. But The Coma was, I think, his second or third novel. Very short. Actually reminded me of this book a little bit, especially the first half, because it's a very also kind of dislocated story of a man who basically gets mugged and ends up in a coma. And most of the book is him just trying to figure out what's going on, who he is, where he is, if he can trust his own memories. And so if you like books like 2 a.m. in Little America that create that kind of feeling, then you will probably also like The Coma by Alex Garland.
Yeah, wow. Great recommendation.
Yeah, that is really good, Alex. I feel like if 2 a.m. in Little America were made into a movie, Alex Garland would direct it.
Yeah.
Doesn't this feel, it feels like a Garland movie, yeah.
All right, Christine, what do you have?
My recommendation is, I was trying to think of what to recommend based on this, and the only book that comes to mind is, there's a lot that come to mind, but I think the one that I can't get out of my mind is the only other book that's ever made me have such a gut reaction, like such a strong initial reaction and sustained ongoing reactions, and that's The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead.
Great book.
Absolutely just brutal to read. That's another book that I wanted to put it down because I was in tears, but I couldn't put it down because I knew if I put it down, I wouldn't want to pick it back up. And so I read it on a sad February afternoon and have not been able to stop thinking about it. It is really well written. It's super short. I think it's about as short as 2 a.m. in Little America, or maybe even shorter. Really incredible story about this reform school that sounds so hellish and outlandish it couldn't have possibly existed, but it did. I mean, with some, it's fiction.
Yeah,
Colson Whitehead took some fictional liberties, as he always does, but just I cannot get over that book.
Yeah, I second that. Great book. Well, I'm going to go full dystopia here. 2 a.m. in Little America is clearly a dystopia. I was looking for a great dystopia to recommend, and you go through all of them in your head. The classics, 1984 and Brave New World. I love of course, The Handmaid's Tale is the famous one, but I don't know, have any of you ever read the other Margaret Atwood, the one that starts with Oryx and Crake, the Mad Adam trilogy? Wow, those are really good, kind of like a biology gone crazy. I also love J.G. Ballard. I don't know if anyone has ever read The Drowned World is kind of his classic disaster novel, or High Rise that was made into a movie a few years ago. But really the one that I lit on was Chiang-Rae Lee's On Such a Full Sea. Any of you guys ever read that?
No.
Oh, it is just, it's so interesting. It's a world where there has been some kind of environmental disaster, and a lot of Chinese workers have been imported to America. They live in kind of a work camp in Beemore, and they provide food and services to these charter villages. And there's also kind of a vast wasteland, that kind of a lawless, governmentless wasteland. And everyone in this world is also afflicted with a disease called C that is eventually going to kill them. And it's all mixed up. It's the story of a young woman named Fan who goes out in search of her boyfriend who's disappeared. And it's written in first person plural. It's actually told by this work camp where she lives, as if they're all telling the story together. I actually read it twice, and the first time it didn't even strike me. The second time I read it, I didn't even remember that I'd read it.
What made you pick it back up again? You just
I had it was on a list of great dystopian novels or something like that, and I thought, oh, that one looks really interesting, and I was just absolutely loving it. And then it came to this scene, this super weird hypnotic scene that I was going, oh man, I remember that scene. I don't remember reading this, but it had to have been it. And sure enough, I'd read it like 5 or 6 years earlier and completely forgot about it, which I don't know what that says, but man, the second time through it was awesome. So anyway, well, thanks everybody. Thanks for the great discussion, and thanks everyone for listening. You can find notes for this and all our shows, Radio Free Book Club blog on medium.com. You can also follow us, drop us a note on Facebook or Twitter, stream the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Our show has been produced by the great Oreo Jones for 99.1 WQRT LP in Indianapolis. For Christine Hudson, Steve Woods, Alex Mattingly, and all the members of Radio Free Book Club, I'm Ken Honeywell. Thanks for listening. And join us next month when we'll be discussing Gabrielle Zevin's novel Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. There are commas, by the way, between all those tomorrows. Until then, read a book.